business,
marketing,
leadership,
and life.
Welcome to the AMP Podcast with your host, Shane Michelli.
Hi, my name is Shane Michelli, and welcome to the first episode of the AMPed Podcast. This podcast is focused on many topics related to business, leadership, entrepreneurship, and life. Current events, faith, family, football, the important stuff. While I will offer insights, it is our weekly guests that will bring the wisdom. They will share their story and their secrets to success. However, we will push beyond the boardroom topics to hear the story behind the story. A candid look at what motivates the leader, their hobbies, interests, and hopefully their quirks. The direction of this project was inspired by one of my closest friends. He was a friend in both business and in life. Our regular conversations covered many of the topics just discussed, but with a heavy dose of the quirks. During the early days of the COVID lockdown, he and I would talk multiple times a week, planning our strategy, leaning on one another, talking about the challenges we were facing, and celebrating the great things. It was during one of these conversations that he said, "I've got it. The name of your podcast should be Amped. No matter how I feel when we get on the phone, I always feel energized when we get off. I'm amped." Now, obviously, I agreed, but with one caveat. He would be my first guest. I set my target on the summer of 2022 to launch the first episode, and we moved on. A few months back, we were on a video conference, a meeting, and I was waiting for my friend that he was going to be a member, he was going to be joining us, but he never did. Shortly after the call, I was notified that my friend had unexpectedly passed away. There was no notice. He didn't have a knowledge of any conditions. There were no obvious reasons. His life is just truly unpredictable. Greg Leakley was a dear friend to me and many others, but he was so much more. Greg and I had often talked about what inspired us, what grounded us, and what motivated us. He was more than a mentor. Now, the concept of mentor is prevalent in our world today, and for good reason it is. If you've had a mentor or you've been one, you know why. A mentor is someone that'll influence you and they'll challenge you, but it's not usually a symbiotic relationship. As I was preparing for my first recording, I was continually reminded of Greg's commitment to be my first guest. If I'm being honest, I had a little bit of the wind taken out of my sails, just thinking back on, Greg not being my first guest and the fact that he wasn't here. But in the back of my mind, it was like I could hear Greg telling me to press on, not to let one negative event stop me from pursuing my passion. And that was where so many of our conversations ended. So with that being said, the first episode of Amped is dedicated to the memory of Greg Leakley. I chose to pass on having a guest for this episode. Instead, I wanted to talk about influence, inspired by my friend. I mentioned mentor earlier and said Greg was more than that. As I was preparing, there was one topic that overshadowed all of the others. See, when I developed the notes for this topic a few years back, Greg was the person that I shared them with. We vetted them. We discussed them at length. See, we're both very careful of who we allow to speak into our lives. Although sometimes that occasional bad voice would find its way in. And after enough of these deflating and negative people had come in, I developed the see people clearly method. C being the letter C. Through my experience, I found that the types of people we were surrounded with was important, but the role we gave them in our lives was even more important. These roles were the C's: critics, confidants, cheerleaders, and champions. The first of these is critics. You know, the judgmental type. I don't mean negative or destructive. If you've got someone who's tearing you down or destroying you or wants to see the worst happen to you, just take them out of your life. Remove them from your life. They don't belong in one of those roles or any other role. Just remove them. What we're talking about is the ones that always counter your point. They challenge your directions and your beliefs. Seemingly, life would be better without these critics, but that isn't the case. You should hear them, process their thoughts, and use this to test your convictions and resolve. If a critic can sway you too easily, it's probably for the best. The second C is a confidant. We've all had that person that's been our sounding board, or we've probably been someone's sounding board. This is the person that we know will always listen to us. And if and when they respond, it is always after they've pondered it for a bit. Most times, or actually many times, they'll never offer any words, only support. But however, if confidants do speak, make sure you turn your ear to them because it is likely sage advice. Thirdly is the cheerleader. The hype. These are the expressive people. They're charismatic. Everyone loves being around them. You know when they enter a room. They love giving high fives and blue skies. We need these types of people in our life, but be careful to plant cheerleaders in moderation. As I mentioned, cheerleaders are expressive, and a lot of times their ears don't work too well. But it's when their ears do work that you have to worry. It's why it's important to keep your C's organized. Cheerleaders can't help themselves. If they know it, they'll spit it. If you give your cheerleaders confidant conversations, then don't complain when everyone knows your business. Now, the last C is the most rare of all. It's the mentor times 10. This is your champion. We all need a champion, but don't be too hasty about giving away that designation. Champions are the other 3 C's rolled into one with a heaping portion of compassion and consistency. I must be on a roll with my C's today, I guess. These are the people that pick you up when you're down. They ground you when you need it. They're vested in your success in both business and in life. They walk with you, celebrate with you, and they cry with you. They're the person you turn to with good news and bad news. If you're married, hopefully your spouse is your champion. But if you have children, take on the role of a champion with them with vigor. Now, that being said, it's also prudent and practical to have a champion in your professional life. Greg was a champion in my life. And while there's a void, I have the memories and hundreds of hours of conversation and advice to lean on. Greg and I had a common faith, and he would remind me of that when I tried to conquer the world on my own. He was quick to offer advice, but even quicker to offer prayers. Not in that hokey way that so many of us have experienced, but in a very real way. Greg walked his convictions. Once we were in a high-level business meeting, and one of our guests, you could tell he was troubled. He just out of the blue, he started sharing some of his burdens with us. Without making it awkward, without causing a scene, Greg just stopped the meeting and asked the guest, "Would you like for me to pray with you?" Now, this isn't meant to be some preachy, holier-than-thou topic. And my main point, the reason I mentioned this, was Greg wasn't afraid to follow his charter. His convictions loomed large. Whether you agreed with him or not, you had to respect his consistency. I have so many Greg stories, but we'll save those for a later day. The last Gregism I will offer was his challenge to me after I so eloquently shared this topic with him a few years back, or so I thought. He asked me what kind of C was I to others. Was I consistent or was I a shapeshifter? Nothing like having your own topic turned back on you. There it is, our See People Clearly challenge. Identify who is speaking into your life. Who are your critics, your confidants, your cheerleaders, and your champions. Then, identify your role in how you will speak into other people's lives. It was when Greg threw down the gauntlet that I realized that if I truly wanted to be a selfless leader, that I clearly needed to identify my role in the lives of others and pursue them with passion. So I hope you've enjoyed AMP's first interview as much as I did. Greg was a gracious guest as always. The work up to this interview was emotional for me, but as with any Leakley interaction, I'm walking away feeling inspired. It is my hope that you too will walk away inspired and set out to identify the roles others fill in your life while passionately pursuing your role in the lives of others. I'd love to hear your stories, questions, comments, and criticisms. It's been a pleasure sharing with you today, and I look forward to releasing a new podcast every Tuesday morning at 8 a.m. Thanks for listening.
This episode of the Amped Podcast was brought to you by
Rio Ray Premium Optics, prescription-ready polarized sunglasses. Visit RioRayOptics.com to design your perfect pair.
The Cherokee Invitational Women's Basketball Tournament, showcasing athletes and empowering women. December 20th through the 22nd, 2022 in beautiful Cherokee, North Carolina. Visit CherokeeInvitational.com to learn more.
The Blue Aqua Group, a strategy and marketing consultancy, combining blue-collar work ethic with C-suite experience. Read our story at blueaquagroup.com.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please consider subscribing